They say when a man builds his heaven on the bones of the starving, the earth itself will demand payment. In the winter of 913 AD, Bishop Hatto of Mainz learned this truth in the cruelest way imaginable, not through sword or fire, but through the beaks of 1,000 hungry ravens that would strip his flesh as he had stripped the people of hope. The Rhine Valley in 913 was a graveyard dressed as farmland. 3 years of failed harvests had turned the fertile German countryside into a wasteland of skeletal trees and hollowed-out villages. Mothers boiled leather scraps to feed their children. Men ate grass until their stomachs bloated and burst. The roads leading to Mainz were lined with the dying, their hands outstretched toward the great cathedral that pierced the gray sky like a golden dagger. And inside that cathedral, surrounded by vaults overflowing with grain, sat Bishop Hatto, a man whose crimson robes were worth more than 100 peasant lives, whose fingers bore rings that could have bought bread for entire villages. Hatto was no fool. He knew what waited outside his walls. He could hear them, the desperate chorus of the hungry, their voices cracking as they begged for mercy, for grain, for anything that might postpone death another day. But Hatto had been raised in halls of marble, educated by scholars who taught him that the poor were poor because God willed it so, that suffering was the natural order separating the blessed from the cursed. When his advisors suggested opening the granaries, even just slightly, Hatto's response was cold as winter stone. "If we feed them now," he said, adjusting his jeweled mitre, "they will expect it forever. Better to let nature take its course." But nature has a way of refusing the scripts written by men. As January turned to February, the crowds outside the cathedral swelled. Thousands now, their faces gray as ash, their children silent because crying required energy they no longer possessed. The city guards could barely hold them back. Hatto watched from his tower window as the mass of humanity pressed against the gates, and in that moment, something shifted behind his eyes, not compassion, but calculation. He called his advisors to his private chamber, where tapestries depicted Christ feeding the multitudes, and announced his solution with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable by earthly justice. "Tell them," Hatto instructed his heralds, "that the bishop has heard their cries. Tomorrow at dawn, all who hunger should come to the old barn beyond the city walls. There will be food enough for everyone." The announcement spread like wildfire through the frozen streets. Hope, that dangerous and beautiful thing, rekindled in hearts that had forgotten its warmth. Mothers wept with relief. Fathers praised God and Bishop Hatto in the same breath. By midnight, hundreds had already gathered at the barn, unwilling to risk missing their deliverance. By dawn, the crowd numbered nearly 1,000, every man, woman, and child who could still walk, all pressed together in that massive wooden structure, their breath creating clouds in the frigid air as they waited for the doors to open and reveal the promised grain. The doors did open, but no grain emerged. Instead, Hatto's soldiers appeared, carrying torches that burned orange against the pale morning sky. The bishop himself stood on a small rise, watching as his men surrounded the barn. Someone in the crowd noticed the soldiers weren't bringing food. Someone else saw the torches moving closer to the walls. Understanding rippled through the packed mass of humanity like a death shudder, and the first screams began just as Hatto gave the signal. The soldiers threw their torches. The dry wood of the barn caught instantly, flames racing up the walls with a sound like tearing silk. Inside, 1,000 people clawed at doors that had been barred from the outside, their bodies crushing against each other as the fire consumed oxygen and flesh without distinction. Hatto watched it all. Some accounts say he smiled. Others claim his face remained impassive as stone. But all agree on what he said as the screams reached their crescendo and the barn became a towering inferno that could be seen for miles. Listen to them squeal, like rats in a barn. He turned his horse and rode back to Mainz, where he ordered wine brought to his chambers and slept soundly that night, perhaps dreaming of the grain he'd saved, the mouths he'd silenced, the problem he'd solved with the brutal efficiency of a man who believed himself beyond consequence. But the bodies of 1,000 people don't simply vanish. Their bones lay in the ruins of that barn, picked clean by dogs and crows, while survivors who'd been too weak to make the journey spread the story of Hatto's solution throughout the Rhine Valley. The tale reached other bishops, nobles, even the emperor, and while none moved to punish him, something else did. Within weeks, Hatto began to notice them, ravens, first a few, perched on the cathedral spire, then dozens, circling the square below his window, then hundreds, their black wings blotting out the sun as they gathered in numbers that defied nature. They didn't scatter when approached. They didn't flee from stones or arrows. They simply watched, their obsidian eyes fixed on the tower where Hatto conducted his daily affairs, and waited. The bishop tried to ignore them. He increased his guards, blessed his chambers with holy water, had priests perform exorcisms that sent Latin prayers echoing through the stone corridors. But the ravens multiplied. They covered the cathedral roof like a living carpet. Their calls harsh, grating, relentless, made sleep impossible. Hatto's servants began to whisper that this was judgment, that the birds carried the souls of the burned, that they wouldn't leave until blood paid for blood. Hatto, whose certainty had never wavered before, felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: fear. Not the abstract fear of divine punishment in an afterlife he'd never quite believed in, but immediate, physical terror of beaks and talons and eyes that seemed to see through his crimson robes into the hollow place where his soul should have been. In desperation, Hatto fled. He abandoned his cathedral, his city, his comfortable existence, and rode hard for the Rhine River, where a tower stood on a small island, the Mäusturm, the Mouse Tower, built generations earlier as a customs post. It was isolated, defensible, accessible only by boat. Hatto reasoned that birds couldn't follow where walls and water protected him. He barricaded himself inside with provisions enough for months, dismissed his servants, and sealed every window with heavy shutters. For one night, silence reigned. Hatto ate cold meat and bread, drank wine that tasted like ashes, and convinced himself that he'd outsmarted whatever curse or coincidence had brought the ravens to his door. The scratching began at midnight. Soft at first, so soft Hatto thought it might be branches against stone, though there were no trees on the barren island. Then louder, persistent, coming from everywhere at once. He lit candles with shaking hands and saw them through the cracks in the shutters. Thousands of ravens, more than he'd ever imagined, could exist in one place, covering every surface of the tower like black snow. They were scratching at the mortar between stones, pecking at the wood of the shutters, their beaks working with the patience of creatures that understood they had forever, and Hatto had only the food in his larder. He screamed for them to leave. He prayed. He wept. But the scratching continued, hour after hour, day after day, until Hatto realized with absolute clarity that he hadn't escaped to safety. He'd trapped himself in a tomb. When the shutters finally splintered, some say after 3 days, others claim it was weeks the ravens poured through like floodwater. Hatto tried to fight them off with a torch, but there were too many, and they weren't afraid of fire. They came at his face first, going for his eyes with the precision of creatures that had learned anatomy by picking apart corpses. He felt his vision darken on one side, then the other, and still they came tearing at his ears, his lips, his fingers, as he raised them to protect what remained of his face. The pain was beyond anything he'd imagined, beyond anything the people in his barn had felt, because his death was slower, more deliberate, orchestrated by beaks that knew exactly how to prolong agony. They ate him alive, not quickly, not mercifully, but methodically, stripping flesh from bone while his heart still beat, while his mind still functioned enough to understand that this was payment, that every tearing beak was justice rendered for every child who'd burned, every mother who'd watched her family consumed by flames he'd ordered lit. When his screams finally stopped, the ravens continued their work, cleaning his bones with the thoroughness of creatures fulfilling a sacred duty. And when they were finished, when nothing remained but a skeleton in tattered crimson robes sprawled on the stone floor of the Mouse Tower, the ravens left, all of them in a single black cloud that rose from the Rhine and dispersed into a clear blue sky, never to return. The tower stood empty for days before anyone dared approach. When they finally entered, they found Bishop Hatto's remains arranged almost peacefully, his bones picked so clean they gleamed white in the dim light. Some claimed they could still smell burning wood. Others swore they heard distant screaming carried on the river wind. The church, embarrassed by the story and its implications, tried to suppress the tale, but it spread anyway, passed from village to village, generation to generation, a warning written in bone and beak about what happens when those entrusted with mercy choose cruelty instead. The Mouse Tower still stands today on its island in the Rhine, a stone finger pointing at the sky. Tourists photograph it. Historians debate the exact details of Hatto's crimes and punishment. But locals know better than to approach too closely when the ravens gather there during certain gray afternoons, their wings casting shadows that move like flames, their calls sounding almost like the screams of 1,000 hungry people who learned too late that promises from powerful men are often just kindling for fires that will consume them. History doesn't record whether Hatto found God in his final moments, whether his stripped and broken mind achieved the repentance his comfortable life had never required. But it remembers this, that he built his legacy on the ashes of the innocent, and the ravens built theirs on his bones. That sometimes the justice human courts won't deliver arrives on wings black as judgment, with beaks sharp as consequence. That the powerful may believe themselves beyond accountability, but the earth keeps its ledgers, and payment always comes due, if not in this life, then in the manner of death and in the stories that echo long after the screaming stops. If this story made you think, don't look away. Like, share, and subscribe for more dark truths buried beneath history's blood-stained pages, because the past isn't dead, it's still warning us. The bishops and nobles may have changed their titles, but the choice between mercy and cruelty remains the same. And somewhere, always, the ravens are watching.